It's one of the defining traits of the Trump era. Stories that would once have dominated the news cycle get only moderate attention and then fade away. Possible case in point, a new rape allegation leveled at the president himself, which critics say hasn't received nearly the coverage it deserves. Adam has more.
The allegation broke 1 week ago in a New York Magazine cover story. Advice columnist E. Jean Carroll says that in the mid-'90s, Donald Trump sexually assaulted her in a dressing room at Bergdorf Goodman. At first, there was a flurry of coverage.
The new allegation of sexual assault against President Trump.
More serious allegations this time around, a physical force here.
It hurt, and it was against my will.
But the next day, Carroll's allegation wasn't front-page news in the New York Times, the LA Times, or the Wall Street Journal. And on Sunday, the political talk shows gave the story a pass.
President Trump makes an 11th-hour decision.
Orders, but then calls back airstrikes on Iran.
Which left critics wondering why a rape allegation against the president isn't getting more attention.
Joe Biden placed his hands on a woman's shoulders, and that got more press coverage.
There are so many accusations against Trump, each individual case doesn't get enough press.
Maybe, or maybe the fact that Carroll's charges folded into a whole book about hideous men played a role. Either way, on Wednesday, the podcast The Daily featured two women who confirmed Carroll's account on the record.
I remember her saying repeatedly, "He pulled down my tights,"
suggesting the story hasn't run its course just yet.
No, and it is on the front page of the New York Times today. And I mean, you can understand why newspapers like the Times or the Los Angeles Times would hold it until they felt like they had confirmed it for themselves. I mean, oftentimes, though, they reference it in another story or in a little box or something like that. There wasn't even so much of that until they really dug in it themselves.
The Times kind of tried to do that in a way that I think was disastrous. They covered it as a book story initially, which had a lot of people saying, this is not just a book story. The charge is being made in a book, but this is much, much bigger than that. And then Dean Baquet, to his credit, issued a mea culpa, said we didn't really take this as seriously as we should have at first, in part because we couldn't corroborate the details ourselves. I think if they had just waited and then come out with new details, like getting people to confirm the account, that would have made people respond more positively to the way they handled it.
I mean, I agree it's not a book story, but what kind of story is it? Is it a crime story? A crime story would normally have a charge, an arrest, some kind of paper trail, maybe a trial, evidence, judicial process.
It's a pattern of behavior story.
It's a pattern. I'm not saying it's not a story, and I think, once again, we see why women are so reluctant often to come forward with rape allegations that amount to a he said, she said, the contemporaneous friends they confided in notwithstanding, because they're confronted with all sorts of skepticism. But look, news organizations are obligated to not just run with every allegation that comes in, and that's at the crux of the problem here.
Yeah. Except that if you were doing cable news and this came up with anybody else, they'd be running with it for 10 days straight, every hour. It would be, yes, what happened on the border, but this story would come up as well. So that is a little peculiar. So my take on it is that she's a little bit odd, and in these cases, the closer you get to pure victim, the better in terms of carrying the message. That is not fair. I am just saying that I know it plays a part in the whole thing. And so then when people said, well, wait a minute, she did tell two friends, and here they are coming forward, then she got less odd and I think more credible.
Well, I mean, for one thing, it's not new news about Donald Trump. I mean, an allegation like this is not new. It's not sort of fresh news, so it's not shocking. So that affects the way people kind of think of placing it fair or unfair. I mean, the interesting thing about that piece is Callie was saying I would encourage anyone to read the New York Magazine excerpt because it's really about a generational shift in how these issues and how these alleged attacks are approached by women. And it really kind of goes through her thought process, about when she says this happened to her, why she didn't report it, why she didn't report
didn't
other
think of
things
it as a rape.
I mean, this is about things that happened to her, not, she has accusations against a lot of different men, most of them unnamed, but some of them named, and goes through that thought process as almost an historical document. It's fascinating.
We'd be remiss, I think, if we didn't give the New York Post all sorts of disgust and contempt for publishing a story about this and then just deleting the story, reportedly, according to CNN, because Carl Allen, the Rupert Murdoch lieutenant, who's also a professed Donald Trump fan, apparently decided that he didn't want it to be in the paper, which is, I think,
he also deleted it from online as well. So
right,
it was,
right.
Yes.
Yeah, they just got rid of it. They disappeared it, which is
I'm
very
just saying,
On the
solid.
internet, everything lives for a while.
People were jumping all over the New York Times, and I don't want to carry their water. But if you're going to claim to me that the New York Times is motivated to cover for Donald Trump, I'm sorry, I'm not buying that. There are valid reasons why a news organization might decide to proceed with caution. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.